fellow knitters, welcome to my joining series. This is a two-part video within the series entitled The Mattress Stitch. So this is part one of the Mattress Stitch, and then there's a separate video in the series, part two. So in this particular part, I'm going to show you how to join pieces of knitting side by side or salvage edge to salvage edge in such a way that you don't have a seam. So typically when you join squares or pieces of knitting, there's a seam in between depending on how you join them. There are a couple of ways of joining your knitting that produce a seamless joint. This is one of them, which is the mattress stitch. Another one is the Kitchener stitch, which actually I have a video for as well. That's within this series if you want to look for it. This is a sewn stitch, so you will need a piece of yarn, and then you'll need a tapestry needle. The yarn that you use, or the color of the yarn, does not matter because the seam is invisible. You won't see the yarn at all. In fact, you won't even see it on the back. So you can see the back of this piece. This is 3 squares that I've joined already. I'm going to join 5 in this row. And you see there's a seam here, but that's on the wrong side of your work. And that's literally where the edges have been brought together or pulled together using this crisscross pattern that I'll show you guys how to do. So before you get started, you want to make sure that your squares are in the right position. It's kind of easy for this project. This is the Ridge Afghan because of the color scheme. So with the color scheme, it's very easy to see what's your cast on edge, which is, this is the cast on edge right here, versus your bind off edge, which is up here. But because these involve 2 different ridge patterns, you want to make sure that they're aligned in such a way that give you that continuous ridge. For example, if you were to align it this way, this would not work because they don't match up, and that would ruin your pattern. So you want to make sure that they are aligned before you start. The other thing that I want to make sure that I do is I always start from when I'm sewing this stitch, or attaching these two, always begin at the cast on at the bottom where you cast on your stitches, and then end at the top where you bind off. Alright, so before we start, I'm going to show you real quick what we're actually going to be working with regard to how we are putting these together. So if you look at the edge of your work, you've got this kind of, it's not so pretty looking first row. So yeah, I'm sorry, column. So each one of these going down, they're columns. There's columns of V's, as you can see. So on this edge, there actually is a column of V's, but they kind of look ratty because you've turned your work, and so they kind of, the V's kind of twist back and forth. You can actually, there's a way that you can do a salvage edge that avoids that twisting, but because we don't count that first column, or we're not going to include that first column when it comes to the face of our work, it doesn't really matter what it looks like because it's going to be hidden on the back anyway. So this edge that I talked about is right here. So this is the first one. You can kind of turn it on its edge. Now the second column is your true first column of these, and that's what you see here in between my thumbnails. So this right here is your salvage edge, that's the twisted V's, and then this one here is your true first column of pretty V's. Now in between those two, if you kind of stretch it apart, you'll see what looks like a ladder, or the rungs of a ladder. And those rungs, or those pieces that go across horizontally, those are actually the pieces we're going to be working with on each side. So on the other side, kind of same thing. You've got this twisted edge right here, and then if you kind of stretch it from this first column of V's, I'm sorry, second column of V's right here, which is your first true column, you kind of pull apart, you'll see those rungs. So those are going to be what we're hooking when we go back and forth. Alright, so with your working yarn, it will need to be about at least 2 times the length of your work, between 2 and 3 times. If you do 3 times, I usually have some left over, so in the interest of waste, it's just 2 should be perfectly fine. If you don't want to do shorter than twice the length, because then if you run out of string here, then you'll have to stop and put a new one in or tie it in. It's just easier to use one. Now in part 2 of this series, mattress stitch, I'm actually going to be joining a row, and there's 5 squares in a row, of cast-on edges to bind off edges. And of course that's really, really long, so in that case we will have to rethread 2 or 3 times. And I usually rethread right here at the joints versus in the middle of the square. Alright, so the first thing you want to do is you want to take, and I always start with my right square, is make sure that you've identified where it is in between that twisty side edge and that true first column of these, because what we're going to do is at the very bottom where that cast-on stitch was, we're going to thread our needle upward, because we want to make sure that we are, because we're in essence we are working in that in between column. So you want to make sure that you're positioned there, and then leave a tail, because you will be, and I'll show you this at the end, weaving in that end into the back of that seam that's on the wrong side. And then you do the same thing. You kind of come down here to the bottom in between that ugly edge and that first true column of these, and then you go upwards. Make sure you're in between those, because again that's the position you're going to be in. Okay, so it's you're coming upwards on both sides, the right as well as the left. All right, and then what you're going to do is you're going to do a crisscross back and forth figure 8, basically within those rungs. So what you do is you go into, and this we're going back to the, because we just finished the left one, go back to your right square and you go down into where that yarn is coming out of, and then what you're going to do is you're going to hook that first ladder, or the rung in the ladder. And so we're kind of in between, we're at the very, very bottom, we're in between, and leave this figure 8 loose for a little bit, and then you're going to go over to the one on the left and go down where that yarn came out of, and then hook your first rung of your ladder in between that, those two columns, those first 2 columns. And then you leave those loose. And then you go back to the right, and again you go down where that's coming out of, and then come up and see there's that rung I told you about. It's in between those 2. And make sure you're in the right there. Because see, what I did by doing that, you've actually gone into that column, and that's not what you want, because when you draw these together, the 2 columns of these will come together and it will look like continuous pattern all the way across. So again, that's why and it's usually a little bit more difficult on the first, but once you get going, it's very easy to see where you are. And then you go back to the left where that yarn's coming out of, and again hook that, and you want to make sure, because here's your column of V's coming down, you want to make sure that you're in between that edge and that column right there, which we are. And I usually do about 4 to 5 at a time of these back and forth figure 8s. Don't do more than 5, because what happens is, and I'll show you in a second, we're going to draw these together. And if you've done too many of these figure 8s, like if you've gone, let's say, all the way up to here, it's very difficult to draw and bring the sides together, because it kind of snags or stops down here just because of friction. Now I'm getting ready to draw these together and draw them tight. Now before I do that, I want to kind of place my needle where it's going to, for my next pass, like that, just kind of reserve it right there, because once I draw these together, it's kind of hard to find that spot when they've come together like that. So now what you do for this first one is make sure you're holding your tail, and then you grab the top of your working yarn Isn't that cool? So you pulled them together. And that's what's provided that invisible joint or seam. All right, so now we're going to continue on for a few more. Go down where it's coming out of and come back up. And these rungs are hard to see. I recommend using a tapestry needle with a hook in it, because that's basically what you're doing is you're going down and you're kind of feeling. So that's the second one there, and if you keep going, you'll slip past it and then get the one that you want, which is this one right here. The other thing you want to make sure is that you're not skipping any of these rungs, because if you skip a rung, your work won't line up properly. So in other words, we want the top of this purple to match up with the top of this charcoal gray. And if I accidentally skip one of these rungs, what would happen is the top of the purple would match up with, or could match up with, the first row of this green. And the whole point to this is with the pattern is you want this continuous flow, like it's one color literally changing into another one, but using the same pattern. When you're joining blocks of knitting that don't have a color pattern, in other words, maybe this is solid purple and this is solid white, sometimes it's hard to tell if you've skipped one or not because you can't see that. But sometimes you can, because this is short row knitting, but if you do just regular long row knitting, it's easy to go across because you're looking at your rows, and your rows should, in essence, line up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue up these two blocks, joining them together, and when I get towards the top, I'll come back and I'll show you. So now I'm getting ready to start the green section here. I'll show you how to finish as well as weave in your ends. Alright, so I'm at the top, coming up to the last couple of stitches. We'll finish this off, and then what we'll do is turn it over, and I'll show you real quick how to weave in the end. I use a particular technique. So you just come all the way to the top, make sure that you are at that last rung, and of course we are, and then what you're going to do is just put your needle straight down through that corner, and then close it. That. So as you can see now, it is joined seamlessly. And of course you can see that on the back. So after you've turned your work, alright, so after you've turned your work over, what we're going to do is we're going to weave this into the seam in such a way that it still will not show on the front of your work, because you don't want to you don't want that peeking through, because that's the whole purpose for doing this. So if you notice the two edges that we brought together, these are that, as I explained at the beginning of the video, that ugly end, or that ugly edge that has the twisted V's. So these are the V's we're going to be working with weaving this in. So in essence, what you're doing is you're going through, picking up the first, and always start from the side the yarn is coming out of. Pick up the first two legs on the, in this case, the right one, and then the next two legs on the left one. Go through like that. Pull it through. And then you can kind of turn your work. And then I usually skip some, or skip one rather, and I'll show you why in a second. And again, make sure you're just going through the top. You don't want to go down further, because then you'll be protruding or coming out on the other side with a stitch, and we don't want that. Just pick up those two legs. on each side of that edge. And the whole reason for doing this is just to hide and secure this tail. And then for this last one, I only go through the first two legs. I don't go all the way through to the other side. So kind of right in the middle of the seam is where you're going to bring your yarn out. And this is why, because now what I'm going to do is go down the middle, picking up that, or going under rather, that black. And see, if you pull it tight enough, of course it's a little difficult, but that's fine. There we go, there it is. And so what we're doing is we're now securing the yarn down the middle in between the two edges. Of course, you want to make sure you're actually going under that black crossover. There it is. Because if you're not going under it, you're not securing it in there. And then the final one here. And the other thing too, don't pull too tight, because then you'll draw the work. You'll draw your piece this way like an accordion, and you want it to lay flat. Of course, just snip that end, so, and that is how you weave in the end. So I have two more. This one, my yarn snagged, and so I actually cut it halfway through and then just started a new one. It's very easy to do. You just pick up where you left off on the front, but it all still draws together. So I'll weave these in later, but that is how you do a mattress stitch, to join two pieces of knitting seamlessly, where the columns just continue over. There's no seam down here. Of course, your seam is on the underside. So thank you for watching this video, and make sure you subscribe to my channel. There are other videos in this particular series on how to join your knitting, but I also have other great videos out there and tips and tricks in how to do certain things with your knitting. Again, thank you for watching.